Yo! So, The Tombs of Atuan, written by Ursula K in 1970, is going to start with a girl named Tanar, and she's playing in her family's yard, and almost abruptly, the prologue ends. This represents the cutting short of her life. Chapter 1 begins sometime in the future. She is undergoing rituals to become the Eaten One, with a new name, Ara, which means the Eaten One, to become the one priestess of the Nameless Ones. So if you know anything about the Earthseed series, you know that there's a lot of importance on this duality of names, which will come to represent duality of self. And because it's very much a growing up story, it kind of asks the question, like, who are you going to become? Which one of these people will you become? The Nameless Ones represent a tradition, right? A religion. And because they mean, the name literally translates to, Ara literally translates to the Eaten One, like she's going to become consumed by these gods, consumed by tradition, indoctrinated into this religious heritage. So Tanar is going to be the one with the family. Ara is going to be the one, performing rituals in the dim, isolated Hall of Thrones. And she's going to slowly forget her past, right? Because she's going to be consumed. That's what the name means. She's giving herself to tradition. Allowing someone else your name gives them power over you. So in some sense, by granting these old gods, the Nameless Ones, her name, it sort of ritualistically, but literally bestows them with power, the power of herself. And as a consequence, it's going to lead to her lack of self-exploration, lack of self-awareness. So she's becoming subsumed in tradition. What was formerly Tanar is now Ara, is talking to her attendant because she's a priestess, and she's asking him, tell me the story of how I was found. And it kind of resembles, I guess the way she's found kind of resembles like Tibetan Buddhism, the way the Dalai Lama is found. So like when the former Dalai Lama passes away, they seek out someone born at that same time, that kind of day. And so this is the same way she's located. As her attendant Manat is telling the story, we do hear some interesting details. One is that young girls are not very highly valued in this society. And two, Ara's mother, formerly Tanar, mother was beaten by her husband when she tried to deceive the priestesses into believing that she was not the one born on that day. And as Tanar listens, she summons her resolve. I mean, she's saddened by this story. She wished she could be her old self, but she resolves herself to this fate, right? She accepts it as inevitable. Because as a young girl, or a girl in this society, she doesn't really get to decide. And it's interesting to contrast this with Ged. He thought whatever he had inside of him could be thrust onto society, or thrust into the world. And then because that's what his desire was, the balance, right, the harmony in this world would just rebalance, reharmonize around his ideals. It's the opposite with Ara. She has just fatalistically accepted that what the world and society has told her to do is somewhat the balance, even though the laws are arbitrary, the beliefs are arbitrary. So whereas Ged kind of had to learn to curtail some of his arrogance and pride and self-identity, Ara has to begin to assert her identity and herself. So a little about the world. It's taking place in an area called like the Tombs of the Place, or the Place. And there are going to be three main priestesses on this site. So one is Ara, she's going to be the priestess of the Nameless Ones. Then there's another priestess to the god King, and then there's another priestess to these two other gods. And then there's a lot of other girls in training, and then there's attendants for all of them. But it's a very isolated place. There's no real civilization around them. It's just a religious site kind of in the middle of nowhere. And men are not allowed, or at least not into the more holy sites, the temples and whatnot. Because any man that, violates this is impure, and it violates the sacredness of this site, and corrupts the mindset of the person who oversees these sites. So one of the first scenes where we see Ara as an actual person, she's hanging out with her friend Pent, and they're sitting on the wall of the place, near the tombs of the place, which is where she oversees. And they're just like kind of hanging out on top of the wall. This wall represents a boundary, right? Like they're right at the edge of their world and they can't cross it. They can't go past this. And naturally they're talking about adventure, right? Because they're looking at the fields, they're looking at the plains, they're looking at the mountains and the hills, they're talking about the sea. This is a really good scene. Personally, this scene is probably better than the scenes in Ursula, because I think one of the problems I had with some of those scenes is they're just too brief. A lot of it's glossed over. It's a few lines and then we're on to the next one. But this one had a lot of internal development. So they're talking about adventure and they're tugging the lines of their boundary. We see that her friend Pent is much more adventurous than her. Probably a little more outgoing. And as they're talking and discussing, Ara starts to get, kind of defiant. She starts to get a little angry. She starts to feel restricted. She wants to test these rules. She convinces Pence, let's hide, let's trick some people here. Her attendant Manon comes up, and I think he's like bald, so they're like acting like ghosts and like yelling out like, hey, potato head, hey. And he's kind of like creeped out, like what's going on? So he runs off, he kind of like, he gets out of there. And they're laughing, but at the same time they know we shouldn't have done that. And then Pent is like, hey, we should probably go now. Ara feels this defiant surge again. She's like, no. And Pent is kind of like, hey, I'm going to get in trouble if we do this. Like, well, you're the born priestess. You're special. And she's like, no, let's stay. So sure enough, they stay. And Pent calculated correctly. They do get in trouble. The priestess come, and they're pretty severe. And they punish them. Pent has to sacrifice food for a day, and she gets whids. So she was right. And then Ara is kind of like let off the hook. But she learns from this. You don't break that boundary, right? Right at the edge of that boundary, you don't get to cross it. The world out there is not for her. So this is like her first lesson. And what's going to happen, we're going to see her slowly retreat inward. She's going to become reclusive. Because this is the only pathway open, right? She tested these boundaries. And it's not permitted. And as the story continues, we see that Ara begins to feel like nothing. In chapter 3, we start to see the way boredom develops in her. And we get this line. Her boredom grows so strong in her sometimes that it felt like terror. So she has to find something to do. So what does she do? She starts to exult at the only real freedom she has. It lies in the tombs below. So what are the tombs? She has her own temple, and around that temple are like 9 stones, and they're just, some of them are erected still, some of them have fallen over, and there's like a ritual where they have to pour like blood on it every year and to feed the nameless ones. But beneath that, there's an entrance under the hill, and it's just miles and miles of catacombs, twisting, crazy, labyrinthian pathways. In fact, one of the areas is called the labyrinth. Right, because it's so confusing. Only the one priestess can enter. The more she gets pushed inward, the more she becomes reclusive, the more she begins to rejoice that, hey, maybe I should take pride in exploring these tombs, because the boredom is so intense. Even though she has this exalted title, like the one priestess, right, she doesn't really get to do anything. Her days are so filled with rituals. She's so isolated out here in the middle of nowhere that nothing's really changed. And she begins to recognize it's like, I don't really have any control. Like, my freedom is inward, right? My freedom is the tombs. And we get this line in chapter 3. Highest of all high priestesses of the Kargad lands, one whom not even the God King himself might command. They all bow the knee to her now, even Grim, Thar, and Kossel. They are other priestesses in the place. All spoke to her with elaborate deference, but nothing had changed. Nothing happens. Then it goes on to kind of talk about how she just do her days filled with rituals and singing and chants and making food. And then we get this. And so the whole year had passed, just as the years before it had passed, and were all the years of her life to pass so? Question mark. So yeah, nothing's changed. Exalted rank? Sure. but no control over her destiny. So as the world is being built up in this story, and there is a priestess to the God King, that's Castle. But we learn that the God King is the new ruler, and we learn also that he does not consult the old powers. He's kind of like, who cares about the old powers? Like, I'm a king, I want to be a god. Let's just make myself the God King. If you think about it, Ara rules really nothing. She doesn't have the authority of politics. She's the only real custodian of the Nameless Ones, of these old gods, of this old tradition. She's perhaps even the last believer. She settles no disputes, her power is largely ceremonial, and she's kind of just a figurehead. Whereas Castle, priestess of the God King, does have power, right? Because the God King creates the rules. He has the authority, right? Think about it. There's this whole land, this whole continent or country that he rules. And Castle is the priestess of his religious tribe, right? Like, he's a king and he's a god. So she has the authority to exert. She can exert it even in terms of politics and laws over the one priestess. And what does Ara get? She gets tombs underground. She doesn't rule anything. And if you remember the scene before, when she's sitting on the edge looking out, that's what she didn't have. The God King has that. She doesn't have any of this. There's one point that really emphasizes this. She's talking to her attendant Manan, and he tells her very straightforward, well, you're mistress of all that. What, you might ask? Well, he says, the silence and the dark. So this is all she has, and she begins to take pride in this. Right around here, you kind of start to see in the book a little bit of a shift in tone. This part of the book, it starts to become a little darker. She is beginning to exert herself. The little power she has, the little self-identity and self-expression she has open to her. She kind of takes on this really mean, kind of scornful attitude toward her attendant Manan, even though he's really the only one there for her. She's walking around the tombs of the place with Castle, the priestess of the God King, and she's just really emphasizing, let's put a guard around these tombs. And they're in the middle of nowhere, right? No one's gonna invade this. But it makes her feel powerful, right? That's why she's doing it. It makes it feel like there's a reason. If she puts a guard there, it makes this heritage seem important. She's trying to create a fictional belief that there's something there to protect. So the more she learns about what her heritage is, the more she kind of relishes that everyone's somewhat afraid to enter these tombs. They're afraid of the silence. They're afraid of the dark. And the story continues, and there's a point where the God King has sentenced 3 male prisoners to be executed, and the way they're going to die is to be sacrificed to the Nameless Ones, so to the one priestess. And she kind of gets to decide how they die, right? That's the freedom allowed to her. She descends into the tombs into the Undertomb with Castle, the priestess of the God King. Because they're sentenced here on the God King's orders. And there's this moment where she feels she's done this many times before. And what's happening? Well, she's being consumed by the Nameless Ones. She feels like has this influence from history, right? She's accepting herself into the tradition. She's losing herself, being eaten. When she sees the prisoner, she's talking to Castle. I think she speaks with the prisoners too, but she asks, okay, let their heads be hewn off. And Castle, ruthless as she is, kind of sneers. Really? She's kind of condescending. That's your imagination? That's all you're gonna do? And in some sense, this is her outlet. This weird, bizarre, murderous outlet is a way for self-expression, to use her imagination. So then Tanar's like, okay, well, what if I just turn out the light, close everything so they can't see, stop giving them food and water, let them slowly kind of wither, and then bury them and let the Nameless Ones devour them in the Undertomb in the dark. And Castle's kind of like, yeah. Ara also relishes the idea that when they did descend into the Undertomb, Castle was nervous, right? So what does that represent? The God King doesn't have that much authority down here, and Ara picks up on it. She takes pride in the idea that, hey, down here, this is my domain. This is my freedom.